Awesome. So thank you for coming. What I'll do is I'll give a little bit of a kind of structure for what I'm going to do so that we understand, you can anticipate what's coming. What will happen is I'll talk a little bit about how I ended up in data science and the motivation for writing the book, which will include a bit of my connection to Newcastle and how I was studying philosophy under Bill. And then that thread will sort of come back later. I'll talk about, actually, before I start on that, can I get a show of hands of anyone who has sort of minimal to no idea what data science is?
In this room, yes.
Yeah, okay, a couple of people, okay, cool. So I'll give like a brief sort of snapshot of what data science is, and that'll hopefully make it kind of all of the examples relevant as we go through. And then I'll talk about how I ended up in data science, and then the motivation to write the book, and then reflections on what studying philosophy sort of contributed to that. So, and I guess probably as much since finishing the book, I've realised how much of my thought patterns were influenced by studying philosophy, and I thought, here's a kind of an experimental way to do a book launch. I'll get my old professor in a room with me, I'll talk about what I think I learnt, and we'll see what he thinks, what other people learnt, because I think one of the things that a lot of people don't realise about philosophy is it can be practiced in many, many different ways, and Newcastle Uni used to be sort of world leading in that it was very focused on the application of philosophy to different programs in science and engineering. So I think it could be, we'll see what happens, it's who knows. The idea of data science, the history is a little bit, it's arguable, there's sort of debate between statistics departments and computer science departments about where it all comes from. There's sort of multiple points in time where people have been probing to sort of given a name to something called data science in academia, but none of those mini rebellions in statistics ever really came to fruition. And it wasn't actually until sort of Silicon Valley startup companies were realising they had business models that depended on large amounts of data, and they had minimal direct contact with customers. So the whole business model was based on data, and they needed a kind of a discipline for dealing with that. And so they started drawing in people with quantitative degrees, physics, econometrics, bioinformatics, etc., to come in and try and solve their problems. Some actuaries as well. So if you're aware, there's the closest comparison would be the insurance industry, which for sort of hundreds of years have been building business on top of data. So a lot of actuaries came in, but there was a minimal supply of those. So they started drawing people in from anywhere quantitative. Sorry, and the other aspect of this was that there'd been one of those mini rebellions inside statistics was this recognition that many of the ideas in statistics had been partially reinvented but also rethought by computer scientists. So machine learning was emerging as this field, as a whole new way to build predictive models that had different kind of incentives and different kind of focus. So I think if you're interested in that, there's a good paper by an academic by the name of Leo Breiman who talks about, I think it's called Statistical Modelling the Two Cultures, and so he talks about the rise of this different idea about how you do modelling and the traditional way statisticians think about it versus the way computer scientists thought about it. So that's origins stuff, but in practice, what data scientists do is they'll be dealing with people across an organisation who've got some problem, some business problem that they know there's lots of data about that they want to understand a little bit more deeply, and then hopefully they will build them something that solves the problem. So I'll give you a concrete example. The canonical example is churn, customer churn. So most businesses have customers, otherwise they're not businesses for very long, and not all of those customers stay customers forever. So businesses worry about the customers who come along and then they disappear. So you can think of it, it's a pipeline. You attract new customers at one end, you serve them, some of them leave. So businesses always worry about what's their pipeline look like and what's the churn rate look like. So there's a lot of data science problems where you say, let's take all the data we know about our customer base and try and model the things that cause customer churn so that we can potentially influence it. Does that make sense for everyone? And if you kind of understand that data science is that kind of blueprint, but applied to many other things. So there's a lot of work in forecasting, like how many widgets are we going to sell, how much inventory, how much space do we have in our warehouses, so can we sort of match the forecasting. There's more complicated problems where you might say, okay, we've built multiple bricks and mortar stores, we've got data about which ones work better than others, can we build a model to help us anticipate where we should invest more capital in building new stores or new plants, etc. So it's an interesting field to work in if you're sort of quantitatively minded. You're interested in how businesses function. I mean, there's kind of non-business applications as well in sort of NGOs and government, but the vast majority is business-oriented. You have to at least care about how organisations work and how you can model that with data and potentially modify it. And you have to be able to program. So you'll often see a Venn diagram drawn on the internet that has this sort of intersection of statistics, probability, programming, business acumen, and this kind of overlap. So that's what makes it an unusual and career path, because typically what happens is you study one of those things and you pick up the others along the way and you kind of fall into it, which is sort of what happened to me. So I started here in Newcastle studying computer engineering and then dropped out because I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And then played in bands, did many other things, and ended up studying philosophy. And I came in thinking I was going to focus just on ethics. And I think within a semester I was like, yeah, ethics. And I got really interested in sort of what the sort of fields of epistemology and rationality. So how do we know things, and what does it mean to sort of think rationally about problems? And at that time, the University of Newcastle was kind of world leading in that it had Bill and Cliff Hooker, who were really focused on philosophy of science, were engaging with other departments, doing philosophy, but in action into sort of how do you advance scientific knowledge, and how can philosophy help guide and contribute to science? Because actually, that's in a way that's a lot of the history of philosophy. Now, in that process, I kind of somewhat ironically got back interested in computer science. So, because I realised at the time Bill and Cliff were running a course called Nonlinear Dynamical Systems in Cognitive Science. So, and David also did that course, and you probably also did that course as well, Steve.
I did a cognitive science subject. I can't specifically remember the whole name of it, but definitely studied cognitive.
It would have been that one.
Yeah, it was a great course. I think some of us used to go to it again even after we'd finished it. So the thing that was interesting about that is it made me realise that.
Just for that too. It was an amazing course.
Yeah. So the thing that was interesting about that course is that, at least for me, many interesting things about it, but it made me realise the way computer science can contribute to really interesting philosophical problems. Like there was so much stuff that was happening, and is still happening, that's intellectually interesting, like computer simulations to understand complex systems, in fact simulations of all kinds of systems across science, the study of AI and how that was sort of feeding into the study of cognitive science, so how do you model the mind, how do you think about the mind, many things. And so it made me realise that because I was interested in many different things, computer science was a good way to sort of allow me to contribute and sort of tickle my fancy, so to speak, in all these kind of domains. So it was a lucky accident that I happened to study philosophy here that got me interested in that. So from that point, I went on, studied a bunch of maths and computer science subjects, and eventually got a scholarship to do a PhD in applied machine learning, but for bioinformatics. So what that means is I would work on problems where I would take sequences of proteins, trying to predict these regions in them that have these things called targeting peptides, so you'd know where after the protein gets manufactured inside the cell, where it ends up, and then molecular biologists would use these programs to you take a set of candidate sequences of proteins that you don't really know what do, you look at where they're likely to be targeted in the cell, and you go, if it's going to the membrane, it might be involved in signaling. It's going to mitochondria, it might be involved in some kind of metabolic process there. So it helps guide them in thinking about how to do experimentation. And so this is, I guess, one of the first key things about data science. You can use computer modelling to help bring efficiency to processes, because bioinformatics, which is the kind of data component of studying molecular biology, is just drowning in data. As once we sequence the genome, we basically just got more data and very little understanding. So it's a lot of the computer science tools you can use, and what data science is about is how do you take vast volumes of data and help people be more efficient in how they extract knowledge from it. So that's kind of one of the key things there. I then moved on. I did multiple postdocs, Australia and Germany. When I spilled out into industry, this was the time there was a Forbes magazine article that was talking about all these Silicon Valley data scientists, about how it was the sexiest career in data science. The sexiest career of the 21st century. As far as I'm aware, like, no data scientists have sort of ever appeared, gotten modelling contracts out of it. So that certainly hasn't happened to me, but it's certainly been like a fascinating thing to do. So that's when I started. When I started working in industry doing data science, I spilled out, and all of a sudden I'm working with people from physics, from ecology, from biomedical engineering, all quantitative people, but from very different backgrounds. And I found myself in these big teams trying to solve problems for different organisations. I thought, okay, I'm going to start meticulously writing notes about how all these other people who know all this stuff that I don't know, how they go about solving these problems. And that's when I started working on the book. And I was probably only about a year into that process when I realised most of the reasons the projects work and fail had very little to do with the technical aspects. Like, I mean, there are definitely wrong ways to do things, but there are many candidate algorithms for a problem that are likely to work. And most of the problems relate to how you deal with the people who are giving you the problem to solve. Like, just understanding what they're asking of you, asking questions back of them just to make sure that what they're asking you makes sense, and getting to a place where you're going to solve a problem, build something that's going to solve a problem that's actually going to have an impact. So that process is what the book ended up being mostly about. How to get that, and so that's why it's in some sense called Getting Data Science Done. It's about just what do you have to do to actually deliver results. Now, in the process of writing it, because over time people have asked me about, what is it that you do in that process to make it better? And I think one of the things I realised was some of the tools that I got from studying philosophy here in Newcastle were kind of critical to that path. So one of the key ones that I'll use as kind of a launching pad to start asking Bill some questions is that one of the things that philosophers do is spend a lot of time identifying assumptions, because at least in the kind of analytical tradition, you are analysing arguments that people make, and often that means not just what they're saying, but what they're not saying. So you have to identify all the assumptions they're making so that you can understand if things make sense. So that's been one thing that I think that's been sort of critical in my career. But I think I'd be interested to hear from Bill then, what other things do you think, what other kind of mental tools from analytical philosophy help people in that kind of scenario, like framing problems with people?
Well, look, I think, we had a discussion where we sort of talked about this sort of probing what people are saying and writing to find out, mostly, like, a lot of analytic philosophy is just analyzing what's there. So you analyze whether the argument is valid or not, and whether, but the important thing is, with formal logic anyway, the premises of the argument have to be true in order for the conclusion to be true. And that's where all the interesting action was for me, was like questioning the premises. Mm-hmm. So I kind of discovered the same sort of thing early on when I was doing philosophy. I came to philosophy from physics and maths.
For those of you who don't know, premises is a sort of fancy philosopher term for assumptions.
Yeah, assumptions. And so everybody makes assumptions. Like you're assuming right now that the chair's not going to collapse out from under you, even though that wasn't in the forefront of your thinking before I said it. but you make that assumption, right? You made an assumption that something was going to happen here today based on information you got, however you got it. And so everybody makes assumptions, including anybody who's making an argument for something. And for me, the structure of the argument was never the interesting game in philosophy. It was, what are people assuming when they make that argument? And the premises are the assumptions that they state explicitly, but then there's there's a whole raft of assumptions that they're making before they start. And you can kind of get into an infinite regress if you do philosophy that way, because just sticking with deduction, if you're moving from a set of assumptions to conclusions, you can question those assumptions. And the way to justify those assumptions is to give an argument for each of those assumptions, and you can get an infinite regress very quickly.
Actually, so I think the chair example is a good one, because it's I remember examples like that from philosophy where essentially it's talked about the fact that there's implicit assumptions in your thinking, so many of them that they can't be explicitly represented in the mind because you just there's not enough space for it. So I think perhaps for data scientists it would be interesting to know, it's not just how do you identify the assumptions that really matter that someone's made, and how do you get better at that?
And I think that's the real trick, because philosophy can be frustrating for people, because they, especially if they're kind of quantitatively aware, they know that if you keep repeating that pattern, that this is something that's never going to end. And in a way, I think, and it'd be interesting to hear if John agrees with me, that's what I found fascinating about philosophy. Like if you want to, and it's interesting because you're talking about how to get things done in your book, but if you want to get things done and you've got some asshole asking you to justify everything that you believe to get to where you're not going to enjoy philosophy. But I mean, that was what made philosophy interesting for me, that virtually everything was up for grabs.
Yeah, okay.
At some point, though, if you do want to get things done and don't want to just question stuff, you've got to get some traction somewhere.
Yeah.
And so, but I think where this whole, and it's not just identifying the assumptions, but it's questioning them. So you question the assumptions, and you, a lot of times people think they know what they want, because that's what you do. You go to somebody that has a problem, they think they know what it is, and they have some idea how you can help them solve it. But oftentimes, without probing the assumptions that they're making, you're not actually going to get a clear articulation of what the real problem is. And so I guess you have to, when do you stop questioning? Well, you get to a point where you can start, and then you do an experiment and see if that's right. But if you can't, and I think you cover this well in the book, you've really got to engage with people's assumptions to identify what the real problem is.
Yeah.
Or at least get closer to what the real problem is. And so it's this digging down into the assumptions that they're making.
Actually, I should have said at the start, actually, please pipe up if you want to just say anything about this, because Bill and I, we've gotten on the phone and just spoken for 3 hours and thought it was a 10-minute talk, so we'll go on and on and on. So I think I'll reflect that back maybe in a way and see how you feel about this, is because what I find often when I'm working in industry is I'll probe assumptions to the point, often I'm just trying to test whether the person I'm working with has thought about what they're requesting enough to get a sense that it makes sense. Because so often in data science, because ever since it's been on Forbes as the sexiest thing to do in the 21st century, everyone in management thinks they know about data science, so they'll come to you and say, we need to forecast the number of widgets we're going to sell, and then you have to sort of probe a few times to understand what they're going to do with that forecast when they get it. And can it possibly help, and why are they trying to do it? And can that forecast lead to a series of decisions that can possibly solve that problem in the first place? So in that sense, you probe a few assumptions, and often it's as much about probing the assumptions as much as probing the thought pattern that led them to ask you for what they're asking for.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the
I've got a question about that.
Yeah.
So have you actually had a situation where people have asked you to do something, and then it's turned out that only when they get it delivered they've realised, oh, that's actually of no use to us at all?
Yeah, so
It's actually happened.
this happens to lots of data scientists. So if I come back to the kind of the churn example, it's my bread and butter because it's easy to understand, and I'll come back a few times. Often, an organisation will say, we need to solve this churn problem. You need to predict who's going to churn so that we can then send them an offer. But the implicit assumption built into that is that the churning is somehow related to price sensitivity, and if you offer them the same product for less money, they're going to stick with you. But the problem is it can be related to many things other than price sensitivity, the quality of your product. And so you can get someone who's an absolute gun data scientist to build you a model that, even if they could predict perfectly who was going to churn, you can't do anything about it because you're solving the wrong problem. You've built this idea of, here's how I'm going to take action from that knowledge that was never going to solve the problem in the first place. Does that make sense for everyone? And does that kind of answer your question?
So, honestly, so you're saying vast quantities of money actually get wasted in industry?
Yes.
For this very reason?
Yeah, absolutely.
So wouldn't a hidden assumption there be price is the only
Yeah.
data you've got to look at?
Yeah, yeah. Well, price is the only material
quantifiable
thing that you can use to affect it.
Well,
Yeah.
that segues really well into what I was going to say next. What it assumes is that's the only value that matters to your customer.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That price is value for them. And I think it's an assumption that most people who aren't schooled in values make. Because I used to teach a course called Technology and Human Values, and it was required of all the engineering students at the university, and they hated it. Because as soon as you start wading into value questions, you find that you're asking questions that don't have definite answers. And then, of course, I'm marking their answers to questions that don't have definitive answers, and they get really frustrated.
Yeah.
So that's one aspect of values. And therefore, maybe, people don't like to work with values explicitly, and it doesn't get taught in the university. Like, the only time that they would have a course that was explicitly aimed at analyzing values was when they came into a philosophy room. And so these values, and I think that's where you want to go, is to start to probe the values behind the assumptions. Because there's always going to be a value. I mean, anytime you design something, a piece of technology, you're actually building something that embodies a set of values.
Actually, that's a good point. So this is something that I have encountered. So one of the other kind of quirks about doing data science work is often you'll be working sort of across different parts of an organisation, different divisions, groups of people who have their own kind of, they're measured on different things, they have their own kind of, there's often value systems. It may not be personal value systems, but the kind of the implicit value systems of that part of the organisation. And those things can clash. Like I've found myself sometimes almost acting like as a counsellor, coming in helping these two parts of the organisation sort of merge the two values. So I'll give you a concrete example. Think about media, how media functions. The editorial team has a value system around quality journalism that speaks that's investigative, that speaks truth, that's what the readers want to read. Whereas the sales team has a value system around serving the advertiser, sort of like getting advertising that funds the company, so that the editorial matches the advertising. And those two things are in conflict with each other. Well, they're not necessarily in conflict with each other, but they can be in conflict with each other. And what they want to do, the way they want to steer the organisation can be in conflict. So that was actually another question I have for you is, what do you think philosophers can do when you come to these situations of clashes of values?
Well, the first thing, like I say, the only place that values are dealt with explicitly, at least in sociology and psychology, people deal with values, but they deal with it empirically. Like you can talk about the values that a society has or a culture has.
Yeah.
So it is dealt with, but they don't talk about, well, how do you make value decisions? Because they're neutral about that.
Yeah.
In sociology, different societies just do things in different ways, and we can analyze how they do it, but we can't decide what value is better, so we have no kind of way to reconcile value differences. And so philosophers, I think that's what makes philosophy unique, is within the university structure, is that we try to tackle those value questions. There's no algorithm for tackling them, but someone with a philosophical background will at least be adept at asking the questions. And the first thing you can do is identify what part of the conflict is actually a conflict about values. Just identifying that the conflict is a conflict of values and what the values are that conflict. Like in your example, right? I mean, the editorial staff wants to, if they're somehow politically biased, want to push that, or maybe their primary value is reporting the truth. The advertising people want to sell newspapers. And you might sort of say, well, of course the truth is more important than the advertising, but it's not, because if you don't have the advertising revenue, you don't have a newspaper, so you don't have the vehicle for the truth. So those two things that can come into conflict have to be reconciled. But the first step in that is just identifying that as the problem. Because how many data scientists would be able to sit there and say, look, you two guys have a conflict here, and the conflict is that you have two different sets of values. Like, that's already, a big step to resolving the problem, because you've identified that the fundamental problem here is a conflict of values, and now then it becomes a matter of negotiating. And you become like a counselor, you become a mediator, mediating between two sets of people within the organization that have very different values. And they don't know that they have a set of values that is in conflict with the other group. So a philosopher can at least take that first step.
That must, because you used to teach medical science students at some point as well too. I mean, that must come up because hospitals are a business that also has professionals with a really strong value code. So that must come up a lot in that industry.
Oh, I think it's a huge source of conflict, because in our system, it's by and large the government is paying to keep people healthy, and they've got a budget. One thing that's good about our system is that I think once you get into the system, the doctors have a lot of autonomy to make the decisions on the basis of health, not on how much things cost. However, one thing that, and I was talking to somebody who worked in the health area, and her job is, she's working for insurers, because insurers want value too. Like, an insurance company doesn't want to pay for an ineffective treatment. What they want to do is collect money from their customers and for them to stay healthy, and then if they do need intervention somehow, they want the intervention to be good intervention. So it's not necessary.
Insurers probably have a different view of